So John, let's continue with Peterhouse for a little while. You said that you took it very seriously, and particularly finding new bursars and electing research fellows. Is there any kind of preparation? No one is going to ask me, luckily, to be a master of a college, but
Never know.
if that ever happened, is there any way you can prepare for such a thing?
It's very difficult to answer that question. I don't think it is, because it depends on the particular college. I mean, a small college like Peterhouse, which doesn't cover the whole corpus of knowledge in the way that, say, Trinity, Gonville and Caius or King's does, it has its sort of specialities and its traditions. Now, what I found most intriguing about going to Peterhouse was that it had the reputation, quite rightly, of being a history college. I mean, the very great men of Knowles and Butterfield and Dennis Brogan and Poston and all that. And that's absolutely true. But it was still reputed to be a history college when I went there, and the number of really active historians that were there then were preciously few, because Max Smith, who was another outstanding historian, authority on Italy, had gone to Oxford, and so had Tony
Wrigley.
Wrigley, yes, Tony Wrigley, who an economic historian. But you see, what was being missed by pretty well everyone, including those who were in Peterhouse, about the college, was that there were 4 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry on the staff. 3 of them very active, 2 coming in almost every other day. Max Perutz, Aaron Klug, John Kendrew, the other man, unfortunately, by the time I got there, was suffering from Alzheimer's. That's Martin. But they made colossal inventions and discoveries and advances. And on top of that, you had Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine. And on top of that, you had Christopher Cockrell, the man who invented the hovercraft. And then the greatest living authority on Ovid, Ted Kenny, fellow of the British Academy. I mean, to speak to him, if I want a quotation from Virgil, he gives it to me in milliseconds, in Latin and in English, And there's one of my favorites. I always ask him about it, just to hear the delight that he expresses. Virgil's Georgics, I've forgotten, the 1st century BC. And this is an important message. Happy is the man who can learn the cause of things, so as to trample on fear and inexorable fate. That could be the mission statement of any university. Happy the man who can learn, or happy the one who can learn the cause of things. Universities they are the seats of knowledge. That's where we gain knowledge. They're very moral places in that sense. If we believe in the search for truth, then, universities and colleges should be very moral places. I'm not as naive as to think, that I should be very earnest about this. So when I was appointing fellows, not just research fellows, I would like to test how, integrated they were, and how thorough they were, and how forthright they were, and how intellectually honest they were. I mean, I'm sad to tell you that I was deceived once or twice by people who promised to do something in their scholarship and never did it. I appointed one man on the basis that he would finish his doctorate in 3 months, and he still hasn't finished his doctorate, So I don't like that. But, that's just a minor disappointment. The real joy of being a master is that you can help so many people, help members of staff, not just the fellows, but people who work there, who are trying to make the place smooth running, the bursars and the senior tutors and so on. And the other thing I feel about being a master, if you want to be a successful master, clearly one of the criteria has to be how well do your students perform generally in all the subjects that they study. Now, of course, we have this table of results. I don't think you should pay too much attention to it, but you mustn't ignore it. I mean, if you're going from the top place to the bottom place, there's something seriously wrong. I have a simple theory on this, you see, that there are 2 people who are more important than anyone else in the college as determinants of the performance of the undergraduates. That's the admissions tutor. Because we have to agree, I think, that we don't add a great deal more to the people that we are bringing into a place like Cambridge. They're usually so outstandingly able by the time they've left school that we are just adding slightly more, opening up horizons or giving them new vistas to conquer. And the second person who is vitally important is the senior tutor. Unless he or she really exudes the joy and inspiration of scholarship, I think the students don't get the message. They worry more about rules and regulations and when they can come in at night, or whether they can play football enough, or this, that, and the other. So some of the best performances in Cambridge have come from senior tutors who've later become very eminent. David Williams, for example, became our vice-chancellor. He was senior tutor in Emmanuel for 10 years, and he knew how to handle students. Peter Goddard's another man. He's now head of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. He was senior tutor when he got his FRS at St. John's. So those are the two things that I have learned in retrospect that were vitally important about college. The other thing is the sheer joy of sitting at table, especially at lunchtime, and asking people how their work is getting on. I mean, there's a European historian named Brendan Sims, who you may know, and he's a very serious-minded individual, but boy, is he thorough. I've seen the thoroughness of the historian, the checking of sources. I used to think in my puerile and irresponsible youth, that historians were probably parasitic. Quite wrong, of course. But, I now realize that unless you have a professional historian who can interpret the past and reinterpret it, not necessarily turning over old soil, although some of it does do that. I mean, Roman economic history doesn't change as rapidly as nuclear physics or astronomy. But even so, you'd still need Roman economic historians. Now, I really loved the whole experience of being master of a college. And I think if I were master of a college like, shall we say, Trinity, it would be a much, much more difficult job. I'm not sure if I could do that. Maybe I could, but it's all a question of, how well you can interact with individuals. In a small college, you could pretty well get to know everyone who's there. I could know, I knew all the students by name, by Christian name, because my wife and I had lunch once a week with all the first-year students. There were only 77 of them, you see. That's not a large number. And I used to tell them, if you want to have a word with me when you see me on the court or anywhere, when I'm not in my study, stop me and have a word, and we can talk about things. And that was helpful. It was really nourishing. It was so interesting to find out what made them tick, It made me feel that I was a student all over again. It was lovely.
Well, that's a lovely account. There were just three things that come out of it which I'd like to ask you. One was just to say a little more about two of the names you mentioned. One was someone who sadly died, but I have seen an interview of him. That's Max Perutz.
Yes.
What sort of man was he?
Oh, Max was a phenomenal individual. He was one of my closest friends for nearly 30 years, because not only did I meet him in Peterhouse, but he lived 3 doors away from me. So we used to go for walks together. He used to come to my home, and we used to go, my wife and I, to his home. He lived the life of a cultured Viennese Jew. When I think it was Sir Peter Medawar was asked, who are the three greatest Englishmen at present? He gave the following three names: Max Perutz, Gombrich, V.H. Gombrich, and the man who wrote The Perils of an Open Society.
Karl
Popper. Three Viennese Jews. Now, Max was phenomenally able, tremendously hard worker, but he had intellectual energy of an extraordinary kind. He kept on reading and writing all his life, and he would read widely. He'd read Dostoevsky, he'd read Lampedusa, he'd read Iris Rissa, he'd read an omnivorous appetite for reading. he would read the New York Review of Books and contribute to it. And he loved writing book reviews. You know, he took so much pleasure in writing a book review. And one of his techniques, which I've acquired in part, when he writes on a subject on which he's not 100% sure, he had a network all over the world. He would send a fax or phone them up and say, look, tell me again, what did Heisenberg really say about the nuclear weapon? What was it? And he could have access to all these people. He was a wonderful scholar and a cultured man. And also he had rules about running a laboratory which are fabulous. He would say, when you go to the refectory, or the coffee room of the laboratory of molecular biology, which is what he set up, sit with the technicians, tell them what you're doing, so that they can get involved. And then, of course, they generate new instruments. I mean, Klug and others have followed that example. And now you have confocal microscopy, which is transforming biology and many other branches of science. Effectively, it started in the laboratory of molecular biology, from the technical side. That was one of the rules that Max used to state. Then he would go and sit next to a young student or a young postdoctoral worker who had only been in the lab for a month, and he would say, well, you're from Melbourne, so you must know so-and-so. And this man would feel totally integrated within days or minutes as a result of his attitude. Another thing, give young people room, give them all the credit they deserve in writing a paper with them. Put their names first if they really have contributed greatly. And question whether you, as the supervisor, should put your name on the paper. That sort of thing. Very, very good. Oh, he was a wonderful man, and he was a kind man. You know, when one of his Japanese colleagues who left Japan and settled in Britain became a fellow of the Royal Society, this man's father and mother were relatively lowly in the social order of things in Japan. Max wrote a long letter describing to his parents how much of an achievement their son had made by becoming a fellow of the Royal Society. You know, those are the things that are perhaps not even mentioned in his official biography. But he was a fabulous individual. And of course, he guided Francis Crick. He had wonderful stories about Francis Crick. See, Francis Crick got his Nobel Prize before he got his PhD. Very few people have done that. When Crick joined him, it was as a result of John Kendrew and Perutz together appointing him. Crick was about 34 at the time. And Max said to him, look, this is the paper that Sir Lawrence Bragg and I have just written on the structure of hemoglobin. We're very proud of this. We'll be sending it in for publication tomorrow or the day after. Read it tonight and let me know what you think of it. When it came back, it was full of red marks, filled remarks like, nonsense, non sequitur, not possible, right? Not proven. Now he said that Max used to say, he used to love lecturing about this, if I were Japanese or German or Indian and I had a student who was Japanese, German or Indian, they would never say such thing. No. This is the British system. This is why he loved Britain. He loved the candour of the Englishman saying, nonsense! He loved it. Max was a wonderful human being, and we were proud of him. When he had his 80th birthday, I put on a special dinner, and there on the table was Herman Bondi. And when I first arrived director of the Royal Institution, when Max used to come there regularly, because he was a part-time reader there for 13 years, I remember saying to Max, you must know Herman Bondi, don't you? I know you're both from Vienna. And he said, well, we were both in the same concentration camp. He said it wasn't quite a concentration camp, but they were both sent to Canada during the war, because they both were German-speaking and thought by Churchill to be a danger. You know that incident, of course. And Max wrote beautifully, He wrote extremely well. I mean, I wrote his official obituary in the Times. I'll send you a copy because, he could compare. People would ask him all the time, why is it, what have you done to create a laboratory that has generated 14 Nobel Prize winners already? How have you done that? And Max, being a cultured individual, said, well, look, you could have gone back to medieval Florence, a city of 150,000 people. You'd have Ghiberti and all the names that you would reel off. How did that come about? It's, I think, an open society. It's allowing people to flourish, not being. It's difficult, but there's no simple answer to that question, of course. But Max was a wonderful human being.
Well, that's a lovely account. And the other person who I think you talked a little about, but I've got the pleasure of interviewing soon, was Klug.
Well, Aaron is a fiercely knowledgeable individual. He is, by training, a chemist, but he then studied physics, and he switched to biology. Now, the thoroughness with which he does things, and the knowledge base that he has, he's read extensively. He has a phenomenal memory, but on top of all that, he's got all the biological skills as well as the physical skills. I mean, he quantified electron microscopy in such a way that it enabled future generations of biologists and physicists and biophysicists to solve the structure of viruses and membranes of the living cell. That was impossible until he came along. He transferred, that's why he won the Nobel Prize, amongst other things. Chromatin and various other features, the ribosome. Well, last year's Nobel Prize winner, Roger Kornberg, came and did his postdoctoral studies with Aaron, and when he was in Cambridge, he and Jean Thomas, now the master of St. Catherine's, Roger Kornberg and Jean Thomas did phenomenal work, but under the tutelage of Aaron Klug. Zinc fingers, which are an extremely important branch of biology. You can't understand the living world without realizing a phenomenally important part that zinc as an inorganic element plays in living systems. It's Aaron Klug who first spotted that. He wrote a beautiful Scientific American article on it. Aaron Klug taught physics, chemistry. He was the tutor in natural sciences in Peterhouse at the time he was winning the Nobel Prize. And his predecessor, who got him there, Sir John Kendrew, did exactly the same. So, these weren't university staff. I was very proud of the fact that I had to write a letter to the Times once when somebody said that the colleges of Cambridge, it was the music critic, Morrison, who said colleges of Cambridge should just be halls of residence. And my retort was, look, I name you two people who were world-class scientists who did their teaching. And in fact, John Kendrew was so cultured, and so fluent in German and French and Italian. He taught the history of science as well. He supervised students in the history of science, as well as in physics, as well as in chemistry, while doing the work that earned him the Nobel Prize for solving the structure of myoglobin. These are exceptional people. That's what the genius of Cambridge stands for, really. I never cease to be amazed at the quality of it. Sir James Fraser, Ernest Rutherford, Isaac Newton. Well, think of them all. These wonderful human beings that have given us a legacy of such incredible joy and knowledge. And, well, it's bliss to feel that you are part of that, that you've inherited it. And it's your duty to try and contribute in your own small way to that wonderful flow of knowledge and ideas.
How do you said it was very difficult to pin down what about the laboratory created that inspired creation of Nobel Prize winners, but more widely, is there anything about Cambridge which you think are ingredients or conditions for creativity?
Well, yes, I think there are. First of all, I think people do pursue excellence to a very high degree here. I mean, you just have to look at music in King's. Look at the way Stephen Cleavery tutors those young scholars. I mean, I was at the rehearsal of the carol service on Sunday. The utter pursuit of perfectionism that he does, gets them to the top quality. Now, that happens in physics, it happens in music, it happens in philosophy, it happens in linguistics, not all the time, and depending on the individual. But I mean, there are fiercely able and competitive, in the best sense of the word, mathematicians, astronomers. Speak to Martin Rees. You realize that the man is teeming with ideas, restless for more knowledge, and very good at communicating it to people. The great thing about students in Cambridge is that they are the beneficiaries of three things. They get, on the whole, very good lectures, because the members of staff are, on the whole, very good. Now, they would have that in another university, perhaps, but not quite to the high degree. And secondly, they themselves have been carefully chosen, so they're pretty good material. And thirdly, they have the supervision system. You see, that's unlike most provincial universities and most of the other universities. I've been associated as visiting professor in America and various other countries with about 20 universities in all, and I taught in the University of Wales for 20 years. Well, we didn't have those conjunction of three qualities. I think you've got it in Cambridge, you've got it also in Oxford. This is why we're in League Division 1 on the world scale. I mean, I think that has been set in train almost decades ago. Whatever the government did, whatever the Vice-Chancellor or the governance of the Cambridge or Oxford is at the moment. I mean, I happen to think in moments of gloom that places like Oxford and Cambridge are ungovernable. They're so complicated. But the fact is, it's people with individuals who are restless for knowledge and who pursue knowledge and who try and do better and better things. That was one of Max's great secrets. He always sought to improve things. His next paper was his best paper. And he used to say that. I used to say it too. I said it before I met Max. But it's the way that you should behave if you're in the university, as I was saying to you earlier. It's a moral place. So what a privilege. I was brought up surrounded by people who worked manually. My brother, my father, and all the people in the community were tremendously hard workers, physically. Well, to be given the freedom to be in libraries, in laboratories, to mingle with people of similar disposition who have a thirst for knowledge, what a joy. And it's not work, is it? It's pleasure.
Just one other thing about the college, which I asked also other people who've been masters of Cambridge colleges, who appear to be either agnostic or atheists, like Robert Hind and Martin Rees, how they dealt with the fact that they have to preside over very beautiful chapels in John's.
Well, I've always had a deep religious sympathy. My wife was a biblical scholar, and she read extensively. And I was brought up, I owe a great deal to the biblical belt, as it were, in Wales. I heard some incredibly beautiful and scholarly cerebral sermons in Welsh, in South Wales. And I owe a lot to the sort of the stories of the Old Testament, which I was taught in Sunday school, Now, I am not a convinced Christian, and the older I get, the more mystifying and mysterious I find life to be. But I nevertheless would like to believe, although I cannot believe it, that, a small corner of the Roman Empire has a person born there who is the son of the creator of everything. I find it extraordinarily difficult to believe. However, I think of the incredible contributions that religion has made. I'm not in the same camp as the Richard Dawkinses of this world. I'm much more in the camp of the John Polkingholms and the Tony Hewishes. But I'm not a convinced Christian. And the beauty and the literature and the morality, not altogether comprehensive and consistent, that you get from the Bible, I think is something that the world cannot do without. So I didn't have any discomfort at all about that. I felt very happy about that. And and to other chapels and churches, just to contemplate the eternal mystery, as it were. Whether one, the sad thing about life is, Alan, that you don't live long enough. You need 300 years, really, to do all the things that you feel you ought to do. But whether you'll understand the mystery of existence, how everything was created, how was it created? Even the astronomers and the cosmologists don't know that. The Big Bang, I still have reservations about that, but don't pursue me.
You have reservations about the Big Bang?
Well, I mean, the fact that the Big Bang happened is indisputable, right? But, it's too easy and flippant to say, a singularity gave rise to all this. I mean, basically, it's like the puerile teenager saying, what came before the Big Bang, as it were, right? But, the singularity there is not enough. It's mathematical, it's physical. You can understand things, the laws of nature were set in train there. That is a miracle in itself, of course. As Feynman once pointed out, if the inverse square law, 1 over r squared, were out by 1 in 10 to the 10, the world wouldn't hang together. It couldn't be stable. Just imagine that. It's mathematical and physical. So now you begin to think, well, how does that come about? Where do the laws of nature come from? And are they immutable? I mean, Fred Hoyle used to think, that some of the constants of nature changed with time. Continuous creation became very popular in that regard, partly as a result of that. But I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable. You must speak to Martin Rees about these things. But the cosmos and that there are giant gamma ray bursts coming in from outer space. They emit more energy in 1/100th of a second than the entire energy emitted by our sun in its entire life. Can you imagine that? That was discovered by the American military, who thought that the Russians were exploding nuclear weapons on the other side of the moon. And when they saw these results 30 years ago, they got tremendously frightened. But now it's part of knowledge, the giant gamma ray burst. Well, the father, capital F, of this carpenter's son in Bethlehem, I wish I could believe it in that literal, beautiful way that I was taught at Sunday school and so forth. I cannot make that jump.
Thank you. Can I ask you a little bit about your own working practices? You mentioned going for walks with Max Perutz, and one of my favourite quotations is, or at least Latin aphorisms, is solvita ambulando. It is solved by walking. Many people have found that their ideas come in that form. I wondered when you have your creative moments.
Well, I've noticed, first of all, I walk about 5 miles every day, and I do it partly to keep physically fit, but partly to take mental stock taking. I prepare my lectures. When I was in Wales, in Aberystwyth, I used to walk up the hills and even go to a field of sheep and lecture to them. Nobody could see me, right? And nobody could contradict me. But when I was making my way, as it were, as a scientist, I had to give a very important Royal Society lecture in 1975, and I remember vividly thinking, well, the best thing to do is to go up there and let nobody see you and just lecture. Now, my working habits, I start work the moment I get up, and now I live on my own. So I start working, I referee a paper, or I draft a paper, or I read a scientific paper at breakfast time. And, I work all day usually, except nice pleasant interludes of this kind. But I make a point of either walking around the block or going up to the Gog-Magog hills or going to Midsummer Common or whatever. I love walking, fact, I have a little cottage in Southwold, and I walk along the seafront there, and I cogitate, and it's extremely nourishing intellectually to do that. Also, I find that, you may find this too, I think one of the playwrights, I think it was John Osborne, pointed out that when you actually have your shower or your bath in the morning, I generally find that some nice ideas click into place at that time. There must be some deep psychology behind that somewhere.
I think the eureka moment happened on the Greeks.
Yes, possibly.
The one final question I've got, which is, if you were giving advice to a young researcher, perhaps in science or elsewhere, about how to organize their life and how to be productive and happy, would you have any advice?
Well, I like the quotation that comes from Benjamin Franklin. Dost thou love life? Then do not waste time, because that is the stuff of which life is made. Don't waste time. I mean, you can enjoy yourself playing cricket, you can enjoy yourself climbing mountains, going for long walks, but you know, every day is precious. Learn some new facts every day and understand some theoretical interpretation of those facts. Read, and write. One of the best pieces of advice I was given was by the principal at Swansea. I mentioned him to you a short while ago. Lord Fulton, as he later became, John Fulton. He said, look, whenever you feel you don't understand something, try and write out what it is that you have understood or that you haven't understood. You usually don't write nonsense to yourself. And I took that advice, and you know, I used to rewrite every lecture note that I took, and I became a better chemist as a result of that. I write extensively still, and sometimes the articles are not published, but more often than not they are. But I believe that I understand things better by trying to articulate things, not just in an exact way, but also in a fluent, well, a stylistic way, you know. Obviously one ought to write in such a way as to not just educate, but to some degree entertain the reader or the viewer or whatever. So that's the advice I would give. Read extensively, write extensively, and don't waste time.
Very nice. I haven't actually asked you much about your science, about your chemistry, because this will be watched by a general audience. But is there anything that should be said about that?
Oh yes, there is. Well, you know, for a very long time, industrial chemistry, the commercial side of the exploitation of chemical discoveries, has been rather profligate in the way that it has used resources of nature and in the way in which it has used certain reagents which are harmful to the environment. And this needn't have been so, but because there was no legislation, because they were cheaper and more convenient, people used materials that we now realize should never have been used. I mean, I think I mentioned to you some time ago that concentrated sulfuric acid, concentrated nitric acid, potassium dichromate, they're all frowned upon. You can, if you're a clever chemist, or at least think you're clever, you can design catalysts that can use oxidants just like air or oxygen. Now my last 10 years, 15 years has been what you might call a pursuit in the general crusade for green chemistry. What I've been doing is to assemble catalysts in a solid form such that they can oxidize in a gentle way a particular material using air or oxygen. It's a very benign kind of thing to do. That's what keeps me occupied. I'm also always have been interested in developing new experimental techniques in chemistry. I'm very proud of the fact that in the mid-60s I realized that the electron microscope was a vitally important tool for the chemist. There was hardly anybody in the world who believed that at the time. And when I got to Aberystwyth, I had 3 electron microscopes there. There wasn't a department of chemistry in the world that had 3 electron microscopes. Most of them, places like Harvard even, didn't have a single one. And now, no department of chemistry in the world is without an electron microscope. And such prizes as I've won, some of them have come because of my contribution to the chemical side of electron microscopy. And other techniques too, you know, and needn't go into details. You can use synchrotron radiation. If you accelerate an electron so rapidly in circles, it'll emit X-rays. And those X-rays are extremely powerful, and they're very intense, and you can vary the wavelength that they have. And furthermore, they're coherent. That is to say, all the waves are in train. Now you can do wonderful chemical experiments that enlighten you as a physicist or as a biologist or as a chemist. You can disentangle the intricacies of structure, of proteins, of enzymes, of hormones, of new electronic devices and so forth, using such radiation, synchrotron radiation. I started using that with a vengeance when I got to the Royal Institution. There's a synchrotron in Daresbury. There's an even bigger one now that's come on stream just outside Oxford in the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory. Every major country has at least 5 synchrotrons. Well, we don't have 5 in Britain as yet, but Novosibirsk had 3 20 years ago, and Germany has had 5 or 6. Italy has now got one. Sweden's got one. India hasn't. Yes, India has. Australia not yet, and so on. Synchrotron radiation is extremely important. It's really variable wavelength X-rays at huge intensity, far more intense, about 1 million times more intense than the X-rays that you would be exposed to in a hospital. And that means that you can take a picture, if you like, of a molecule or even an atom in a very, very short time, in something like a picosecond, which is 1/1000,000 of a millionth of a second. A picosecond. Femtoseconds are now all the rage, which is 1,000th of a millionth of a second. Nanoseconds were just coming in when I was teaching, and when I was a student, to do things with a microsecond was thought to be really very advanced.
So, I've covered many things, and you've given me some wonderful material, but there may inevitably be things that you would have liked to have been asked or talk about. Are there such things?
Well, I think not, actually. I think you exhausted most of the topics that I thought that you would raise in this interview. No, I don't honestly think we've missed out anything of significance. So I'd be quite happy to keep things as they are.
That's lovely, because when I asked George Steiner at the end of his interview if there was anything, he said, "Alan, you've been too kind. You should have asked me what my great disappointment in life was." Also, words to that effect.
What did he say?
Well, he said, actually, very interesting. He said his great weakness was envy, invidia, because he spent his life around encircled by these wonderful minds. He'd been in the Princeton Institute and been in the presence of the greatest physicists, and he'd had Borges staying in his house and so on. And he himself recognized that he wasn't in that league, and he felt this Salieri disappointment in the presence of the Mozarts.
Do you know, isn't that interesting? Have you ever met Sir Brian Pippard? Do you know who I mean? He was the Cavendish professor. He's still alive, 87. Terrifically cultured man. Wonderful musician and a top-notch physicist. He taught Josephson. And he is one of the best teachers in physics. Wrote a wonderful book on thermodynamics. He once told me there were just two people on this earth that he'd come across during his career who were beyond envy. One was Lev Landau of Moscow, a fantastic physicist. Landau is the man who coined the expression, often in error but never in doubt. And the other one was Onsager, Lars Onsager, the Norwegian thermodynamist or quantum mechanic, theoretical chemist, both Nobel Prize winners. And Landau never came to Cambridge, but I think Brian went to Moscow on several occasions. Landau died at the age of 61. He was, I think, from Azerbaijan. He was a Jewish gentleman, died at the age of 61. He was phenomenal. I mean, the physics that he could do. I mean, if you ask Aaron Klug where he learnt his quantum mechanics, he'd probably tell you it's Landau's book.
Interesting. Had Pippard met Einstein?
Yes, I think he had, because Pippard was a household name in physics, because he was a bit of a boy prodigy, you know. He spoke so brilliantly, and he wrote so well. We wrote a little booklet together. It was a hand guide to Michael Faraday in the National Portrait Gallery. I was asked to organize it, and I roped in Brian Pippard to deal with the physics, and I dealt with the chemistry. But he writes so fluently. I mean, such a joy, you know. I mean, it's like Hugh Trevor Roper. He has the same gift. And he could express himself terribly well. His books on various books on physics. They're as literary as they are mathematical. You know, they really are good. You might even consider interviewing
that sounds.
Brian Pippard.
I'll talk to you about that. But it's very appropriate that you should end with Michael Faraday, because he was your shining light.
Well, he still is my hero, absolutely. I mean, the nobility of the man and the singular way in which he combined, as I told you before, intuition, insight, you know, dexterity, all the things that, I mean, choose the big problems. Assume that there's an answer to every problem, which may not be true, of course, but he did. And that's one of the reasons why he got so far.
That's a very nice ending. Thank you very much indeed.